Right, this is part 3 of my little 3-part mini-series on spiritual gifts. So, if you're watching this one and haven't seen the other two, I would highly recommend watching those two first, starting with the one called Spiritual Gifts, and the one called The Way of Love, in that order, preferably. In those two, I was in chapters 12 and 13, respectively, and here I'm going to be in chapter 14, continuing that. And this is Paul continuing, as I said, his discussion on spiritual gifts. And in this chapter, previously he'd been not really focusing on any one or two specific gifts, just talking about them in general. Here he narrows it down to two specific gifts that presented the biggest problem for the church in Corinth. The two that are being discussed is prophecy and tongues. Now, Paul is encouraging the Christians in Corinth to continue seeking after the spiritual gifts because they are from God and they should be desired. But he is trying to correct their misunderstanding and misuse of them. So he tells them that the one gift they should be desiring most is the gift of prophecy. And now there's some debate over the meaning of the word prophecy. Some believe that it is pretty much synonymous with preaching. But prophecy and preaching prophecy is preaching, basically. Others say that prophecy is one receiving the very words of God and literally speaking, like as if God is like using them as a puppet to speak for himself. The other is kind of a middle ground, I guess, which is where I tend to fall, is that God lays something on the heart or mind of a person, that person is then to go and speak to either another person or to the congregation. The whole premise of this chapter is Paul saying that if you got to choose between prophecy or tongues, you should want to choose prophecy every time. It seems that based on the writing in this chapter, that the Corinthians had put an extremely high emphasis on speaking in tongues. That was just like the tops thing to do, whereas they thought prophecy was not important at all. But he's saying prophecy is very important. Prophecy is the one you should be wanting more than anything. He's for no other reason than the fact that tongues is used by man to speak to God, which is good. But prophecy is used by God to speak to man. And that is even better, because as I've heard from, it's more important for us to hear from God than for God to hear from us. Because what he has to say is way more important than what we've got to say to him. Now, as for tongues, there's a couple different ways to approach that gift. In some instances, it seems that people are simply moved by the Holy Spirit to speak in an unknown language as a means for them to communicate with God. Then there's also one that was described in Acts chapter 2, in which someone will suddenly be able to speak in another language, another worldly language that other people could understand. That happened in Acts chapter 2 when there was people from other parts of the world in Jerusalem, and they suddenly understood them in their own languages. But the former, the simply unknown language, that's the kind of tongue speaking that Paul is talking to the Corinthians about, and comparing that to instruments that just sit there and that are just making noise. I mean, if some little kid picks up a trumpet and blows in it, it's gonna make noise, but it's not music. There's no melody to it. There's no understanding to it. It's just noise. And he's saying that that's what your tongue speaking is, because there's no interpretation. There's no understanding. There's no building up of the church there. And he says the building up of the church is the most important thing. And so then he shifts his focus to prayer. Now, and specifically to those who would pray in tongues. Now, he's not saying that someone can't pray in tongues when they're alone with God, but he's saying that if someone is praying publicly in church, because that's the context he's speaking this in. He's talking about how the church service should go. He's saying if somebody is praying in church publicly, they should not pray in tongues. They should pray in a language that everyone in the congregation can understand, so that those people can agree with what's being prayed for. They can pray with the person who is praying, and the body as a whole together can lift up that prayer to God. But if that person is praying in a tongue or in an unknown language, the people in the congregation are not going to understand. They're not going to be able to agree with what's being prayed for, and they're not going to be able to lift it up as a body. And he adds that at the end of this little section, he says, I would rather speak 5 words in a known language than 10,000 in an unknown tongue, because understanding is what builds up the church, and that was not happening in Corinth. There was confusion and misunderstanding. There was not any understanding going on there. He goes on to further his argument in favor of prophecy over tongues by mentioning unbelievers or guests in the church. He says that if somebody comes into the church who's never been into the church, and they look around and they see everybody in there speaking in an unknown tongue, and they have no idea what they're seeing, what's going on, and they're gonna look at that and they're gonna be like, you guys are all crazy. You guys are all out of your minds. What is this? And they're gonna leave, and they're never gonna come back, because they're gonna be so turned off by what's going on there that anytime they think of Christianity or God, that's what they're going to think of. And they're going to think lunatics. That's what they're going to think. But he says, if someone goes in and the whole church is prophesying and speaking the word of God, then that person will be convicted of their sin. And they will see the error of their ways and turn to faith in God and faith in Jesus Christ. And they will be saved because of prophecy, not because of tongues. And that was his argument for the fact that prophecy is more desirable than speaking in tongues. He continues on speaking of orderly worship, because apparently here in the church in Corinth, the Christians there had, I guess it was just a thing where they were just doing whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. If somebody wanted to say something, they'd say something, they'd sing something. It was a mess, and nobody could understand anything that was going on. There was no order to it. There was no understanding. But he's saying there needs to be order in worship. He first speaks of tongue speaking. He's not prohibiting the use of tongues in worship, but he is saying you got to do it in an orderly fashion. And so he says, okay, if you're going to speak in tongues, you've got to have somebody up there. You speak in the tongue, and then somebody's got to interpret. Because if there's no interpreter in there, which the fact is he speaks that, he says it in that way, implying that it should be known that there is someone who can interpret tongues before someone decides that they're going to speak in tongues. Because I've been to some churches where someone will randomly start speaking in tongues, and then nothing. Nobody steps up and interprets. Even someone will even ask, "Is there someone to interpret this?" Nothing. Nobody. And that is completely against what is being said here. There should always be an interpreter, and the interpreter of tongues should be known before someone decides to speak in tongues. It shouldn't be, "Oh, I'm going to speak in tongues, and let's see if there's somebody here who's going to do it." No. You should know that there's someone there who can interpret tongues. And if there's not somebody there, or if you don't know that there's somebody there, you don't do it, because that causes confusion. But he doesn't limit his admonishments to speaking in tongues. He also mentions prophecy. There needs to be order when you're prophesying. He says those who want to prophesy, they need to do so in an orderly fashion. There should be 2 or 3 at most, and they should each prophesy one at a time, and the rest of the congregation needs to listen and weigh what's been said, and the congregation needs to determine whether what has been said is actually prophecy from God or just something that person has said. Because this lends credence to kind of my own. This is why I think of prophecy the way I do, because I don't believe that it's necessarily the direct word of God, but it is God laying something on someone's heart. And if someone is prophesying, truly prophesying from God, it will be a message that God has laid on their heart. But it also must be tested, because if God were controlling the person to speak the actual words of God, it would not need to be tested, because you know that's God. That's God speaking right there. But it's not. It's God putting something in someone's mind for them to speak with their own words. And therefore, since it's being spoken by men with human words, then it must be tested and weighed by the congregation. And he finishes out this chapter by basically summing up everything that he's said up until this point. He, in the very end, the very last 2 verses of this chapter, sum it up just the way, in 2 sentences. He says, "So my brothers, earnestly desire to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues. But all things should be done decently and in order." So, if you want to sum it all up, there it is. And I don't really know what else to say about that, other than the fact that there it is, and that's how a church service should be conducted, according to the Bible, and how it says it should be done. Yep.